part 4, beginning with verse 35. In your Bible, it's page 1558. If you want to follow along with me. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" There was a story, and some of you may have recalled hearing about this. A lady by the name of Marlene Dean was a missionary to New Guinea in the late 1930s. About 1938 is when she arrived. She went with her newlywed husband and had even been discouraged for her to go to that area of the world because it was so treacherous getting in there to the natives that many men had actually died. But she was a woman of great faith and was determined that her role in life was to be a missionary, and that if her husband was a missionary there, her place was to be beside him. And so she did head out and go there in the late 30s. If you are a person who understands about history, you know already that being in New Guinea in the late 30s was not the ideal place to be, because when World War II broke out, there she was when the Japanese took over. She was an American, and of course her husband and all the other American missionaries there in the area were taken in and imprisoned in varying levels of security depending on what they were accused of at the time. And her husband was separated from her and put into a camp for men that he did not survive very long. He already had some heart issues, but add that to the stress of being a POW, not getting adequate food, and we only can imagine what other things happened to him. He did not survive, and word got back to her. She was in prison at first in an area where she had some freedom to move, but she certainly was still a POW and served hard all day and most of the night doing menial tasks that were very, very complicated and very tough on her small body and wore her down quickly. But things escalated and got worse, and she was considered a spy. And you already know that it doesn't matter whether you are or you are not. If you're accused of that as a prisoner of war, it is what it is. And she was sentenced to die. She was placed in a solitary confinement cell with only a slit of light at the very top, no windows all around, and fed approximately 2/3 of a cup of wet old rice one time a day. It's just a miracle that she survived. Just as for the rest of us, there's a little bit of light, and so she used the stool to be able to look out of it when she could during the day, to be able to see other human beings. There were other prisoners there that were not under the same solitary confinement or close guard that she was, and so she watched one day as another woman was going back and forth walking around, and she noticed that the lady kept trying to go unseen by a guard and tried to get close to the edge of the fence. And when she watched her eventually, she saw another hand come through the fence and the ivy that was coming down, and it had a bunch of bananas, and it presented it to the woman prisoner, who then hid it in her sarong and ran off so she could have her bananas and nobody know that she had gotten this. Well, Darlene could see that happen, and because she had dysentery, she had beriberi, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and there was one other illness that she had all at the same time and had now gone down to 60 pounds and felt fatigued, and certainly I know she felt like she was dying. When she saw the woman with the bunch of bananas, I know instantly she thought, if I could just have one. And that's exactly what she said to God. She said, she got down on her knees and said, "I am not asking God for a bunch of bananas like that woman has. But if you could just find a way to get me one, I would be so grateful." So she did what I think we all do, if I'm speaking for you or not. I believe that we all sit down after we've asked God for something and try to figure out how He's going to do it. And she said she did just that. She went through the scenario of the possible people that might bring her a banana, the possible scenarios of how they bring her a banana, and at the end she said, I don't know why I'm even trying. There's absolutely no way to get a banana in here to me. It would be a death sentence to those who even tried. And so she got back down on her knees and prayed to God and said, I'm sorry that I asked you for the impossible. I know that you can't do it. I was just asking just in case, but I realize now you can't do it. Please know that I am very grateful for the 2/3 cup of rice that I'm getting in here, and I'm not going to complain anymore. That was that night. That next morning she gets up. She hears, as she said she notices sounds greatly as a POW because she can't see and she's aware of everything that's going on around her. She knows that somebody big has come to the camp. And when the door opens, it is an officer, a Japanese officer that had been in the camp she had been in before. Now, I'm not saying he was a saint or a good man. He was over another prison. But he had shown her some kindness and some mercy because when he came to tell her of her husband's death, he thought it was honorable that she did not just crumble, but that instead she took it with stride and actually said that he had died doing the Lord's work and that she felt like for both of them, they were there simply to be missionaries. And she even said to this prison guard that perhaps she was there for him and that it was worth it to her if that was the case. And nothing was said between them, but she saw this change come about him in the way he treated her. So when he came into camp, one of the first things he did is he asked to be able to see her. He walked in the door and saw, of course, her emaciated self. There weren't many words. He just said, "You're not doing well, are you?" And she said, "No, sir, I'm not." He walked back out. She could hear them speaking in Japanese, and from what she said, she'd never learned Japanese because she did not want to know what they were saying. She had learned other languages. She did not want to know what the Japanese were saying. But she could hear them talking, and she watched as the other guards put their heads down. And so she felt like this man that she had known was probably telling them what type of woman she was. And she did know, ordered bananas be brought to her. She did not ask him for bananas. She would not have put him in that position. It didn't even come up, and yet he ordered for a bunch of bananas to be brought to her. She said when he opened the door, shoved them in, and shut the door, she sat there first and counted them. She had asked God for one. He sent her 92. And instantly she said, "God, I am upset with myself that I didn't think you could get one in here, and you showed me that you could get 92 in here to me." As I said to the children during the children's time, is that the Bible does two things for us. Trials and difficult times especially do this for us. They hand us a mirror so that we can see ourselves. How are we reacting? How are we feeling? What is our faith like right now? What is our walk like with Jesus right now? We can see ourselves clearly, and she did. She, at the minute of one of the worst times in her life, she loved God. She still did. But her faith had just that little bit of weakness that she didn't trust him to do something like get a banana to her. She was able to see that. But the Bible, in times of trial, also hand us a magnifying glass. And that's when we can look and focus on some aspect of God and see it very, very clearly. And in her case, she saw God is omnipotent and there's nothing beyond him. So she could see herself and she could see God very clearly. I think we've all been there where we were in a position of doubting as well, thinking God couldn't do the impossible thing that we asked. Magnification was a difficult thing for me to be able to come to terms with because God is the creator of the universe. He created the world. You can't get any bigger than that. So how in the world can we use the term magnification when we're talking about God? Well, I'm going to give you two examples from the Bible. Many of you may recall this, that in Mary's song of praise, when she heard she was going to be carrying the Messiah, Luke 1:46 reads this way, "And Mary said, 'My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in my God and Savior.'" In a Psalm of David, 34:3, he says, "Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together." So we're not talking about magnification in taking something tiny and making it large, because we already know that God is huge. We are instead talking about bringing everything else out of focus and putting him right in the middle of our focus, some aspect of him. And of course, Ruby was hitting right on it. When you're looking at a splinter, you're looking right at that splinter, and that's what you're focusing on so that you can notice that. It's the exact same way with God. It blends everything else out so that we can look at that one aspect. So let's go back to our scripture reading of today and look at it with the mirror and magnifying glass. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were other boats with him. A furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we drown?" So these disciples were not men who sat around in the market square all the time. They were not men who sat and read books all the time. These were men who were very, very familiar with ships. They were very familiar with storms. They knew exactly what to do. They'd done it 100 times. Many of them probably have done it since the moment they were able to even walk. They were boatmen through and through. And yet, there evidently was a storm at that moment that was so bad that they were losing control. And you know before they went and got Jesus, who was not even a fisherman, he was a carpenter, so you know before they went to him that they had tried every single thing else that they knew what to do. So they knew the situation was beyond their control. They did call out to Christ for him to intervene at that point. But the first words out of their mouth as far as what is recorded in the Bible is, "Teacher, don't you care if we're drowning?" I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I will tell you I've said something very similar. I've said, "God, I'm sorry. Are you awake? Are you even seeing what's happening to me? Are you paying attention? What has gotten your attention to the fact that you can't help me out? Why are you just letting me go under?" And the sensation quite often when you're in the midst of something horrible is exactly that sensation of water being right over your head and you're doing everything you can trying to stay above water. So they're asking Jesus, "Don't you even care?" Well, the next verse says, he got up, rebuked the wind, and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died, and it was completely calm. He said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" He put the mirror up to their face. He wasn't saying, "You don't have any faith." He's having them to question themselves. Why are you afraid? Do you not have enough faith? They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey them." To their credit, when they have that magnifying glass and they can clearly see Jesus, they don't do what I had done in the past and say, "Well, it's just coincidence. Things sort of got smooth again because this happened or that happened or I intervened in this way or I finally had the money to do this or that." They instantly saw through that magnifying glass that the Lord was the reason that things calmed down. So I do give them that credit. I have here that the concerns and fears of the disciples resulted in the Lord getting up immediately and quieting the storm. I love that. When they said, "We're afraid, please help us," he didn't go back to sleep. He did get up and calm the storm. Even though Jesus, he knew they were safe, he still responded to the fact they were afraid, and he did it immediately. He brought it to their minds and did permit them to reflect that in his presence they were still afraid, and that did still speak to a little bit of a lack of faith on their part. I asked myself, did Jesus let that storm rage for a little while so that they could have that context to decide that they maybe needed to reflect on their faith in him? And does he do the same thing for us? Does he let it go for just a little bit so that we can start to have that moment of fear so that when he helps us, when he walks with us, we do know the value of that? Also, did he let it go so that he could point out how bad it was and how great his power was and his ability to control it? The trial gave the disciples the opportunity to look in the mirror at themselves, but also in the magnifying glass at what the Lord could do. But that's not the only case. In the Bible we have many, and we're going to go over just a few of them. Abraham and Isaac. From Genesis 22, God had given Abraham a son in his old age. Isaac was beloved. He was cherished, and he waited a very long time for the son. Yet God asked Abraham to offer Isaac to him as a burnt offering. Few trials in our lives are going to come anywhere close to the magnitude of having God tell you to sacrifice your child to him as a burnt offering. Abraham took Isaac to the mountain to be sacrificed. So Abraham did as God told him to do. But just as Abraham was about to slay his son, the angel of the Lord stopped him. And instead of Isaac, the Lord provided for him a ram. In the mirror, Abraham was able to see that there wasn't anything, nor anybody that he was going to put before the Lord. He saw that in the mirror. When it really got tough, Abraham was not going to put anybody or anything in front of the Lord. He was willing, he could see this in the mirror at himself, willing to sacrifice the very most precious thing in the world to him because the Lord asked him to. In the magnifying glass, when he looked at what the Lord was showing him, he learned that God, with a big G, unlike the little g gods that other people around them were celebrating and worshiping, this God did not ask for us to sacrifice our children to him. And they were doing that. All the other little minor gods that were being worshipped were asking for child sacrifice. But God said, I'm not asking for you to sacrifice your children. He made that very clear. Abraham learned in that moment that God is merciful. And he learned that God greatly rewards and blesses those that put God first in their lives. Esther and her uncle. If you already know, this is the one book, the book of Esther, where the name of God is not even mentioned. But you'd be hard-pressed to find another book where he is more evident. The Jews in the book of Esther are in danger of total annihilation. And only the king, King Xerxes, can prevent the tragedy. And we're talking from a mortal, earthly standpoint. Queen Esther knows that if she goes in uninvited to talk to the king on the behalf of her people, she could die. And that was one of the laws. If you go in to speak to the king, he doesn't hold out the golden scepter to you, then you're executed. So she had not been called in like 30 days to see him. So she knew very easily she could be killed. But her uncle reminded her that she might have been put into that royal position for such a time as this. So Esther asked the Jews to fast for 3 days and nights. And despite the very real risk, she visits the king. The king did not order her death. Instead, it's a remarkable series of events that begin to unfold and unravel, in which the Jewish people were preserved. It's incredible when you read that book to find out how far in advance God had been working to bring this about. In the mirror, when Esther could see herself, she knew and learned about herself that even when her people were about to be wiped out, and she knew that she very well could die a very hideous death, she was willing to risk her life for her people. That's a great thing to know about yourself when you look in the mirror. And she also could see that she was a woman who called out to God. Even though she doesn't say his name, she asked them to enter, or she doesn't say it as recorded in the book. She does ask them to fast, so she's pulling God in to the events that are occurring. These are two great things for her to have learned about herself. In the magnifying glass, what did she learn about God? Well, she learned that behind the scenes, God is at work in the lives of his people. And he can arrange events in such a way as to bring about a favorable circumstance and preserve his chosen people. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and you know them as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these Israelite men were brought to Babylon after the siege of Jerusalem, and they became servants to King Nebuchadnezzar. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were ordered to worship a golden image. And because they would not, they were thrown into a fiery furnace. We hear the term fiery furnace, and so we think about it in terms of the Bible. Put yourself in their position. How many trials have you been through that have felt very, very similar to this? These men are getting ready to die a horrible death because they would not worship anything other than their own God. But in the furnace, God preserved them from being burned to the point that when they came out, it was remarked they didn't even smell like smoke. When King Darius ruled Babylon, he gave a decree that for 30 days nobody could worship any god except himself. Well, Daniel broke that law. He had to. I say he had to because he has to answer to his own God and not the king. So, if you remember, he was placed in a den of hungry lions that would rip him to shreds. But an angel of the Lord shut the mouths of those lions, and Daniel was not hurt at all. Afterwards, when Daniel's heart stopped beating as much, I'm sure, he could look in the mirror and he could see in himself that though facing the very real threat of a horrible, painful death, and we're also talking about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as well, they refused to worship any god but God. And they refused to cease worshiping him just because a man had told them to. They could see in the mirror that they had incredible faith and devotion. Again, a great thing when you hold up the mirror to see in yourself. And the magnifying glass, when looking at an aspect of God, they could see that despite the strong earthly power and control of a king and all of his men, God could and still did preserve his people. They saw that there was no furnace of fire, no teeth of a lion, no political power at all that could harm them. That God's provision and omnipotence was above all of that. They could see that in the magnifying glass. With Joseph, he was the beloved son of Jacob. And this is one of those stories that really touches my heart because Joseph was a young teenager when he was betrayed by his brothers. He wasn't betrayed by strangers. He was betrayed by his brothers. And he wasn't betrayed in a way that things could get worked out in a few years. He was pulled away from the only family he'd ever known, and his father that loved him dearly. He was separated from his father. If you remember the story, when he's a servant, he's a slave. Sometimes he's treated well, sometimes he's not. And he's also falsely imprisoned. This is not an easy life for a boy who had been born into a family where he probably was going to be quite high up in stature. So he had this incredible trial that he had to live through. In the end, Joseph became a very powerful official in Egypt. And his father and his family were preserved during a 7-year famine because of the events that had taken place in his life. In the mirror, Joseph saw that he was able to remain hopeful and dedicated to God through the worst of his trials. And more incredibly, when he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who was able to forgive a great and horrible betrayal and many years of hardship. And he saw in that mirror that he was the type of person who could recognize that it wasn't his brothers that had put him there, but that God had put him there to preserve his brothers. That is actual incredible reflection to be able to see. In the magnifying glass, he could see that God is faithful. He is omniscient. It meant he was giving Joseph dreams decades before the events ever came about. He saw that God masterminded the preservation of the Israelites decades before the famine even occurred. Mary and Martha, this is one that for some reason I think just sometimes appeals to the women a little bit more than they understand. This doesn't seem like a big trial sometimes to guys, but Jesus and the disciples have come to the home of Mary and Martha. You can imagine what kind of work was going to be going on. They probably had to find somewhere for them to sleep, clean linens, enough food, well-prepared food. All these things are going on. It's the household for both of these ladies. Martha is up, moving, trying to get all this planned. And she keeps looking, and there's Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. And I'm sure she's not saying anything to start with. She's just smiling and bearing with it. But the longer it goes, the more upset she's getting. She is in a trial, even if it's of a short duration, enough that she says to Jesus, could you get her up to get her to help me? There's a lot to be done. And Jesus says, well, she's actually chosen the right thing to do, and I'm not going to take that away from her. Well, if I'm like Martha, I'm sure after he said that I would have stopped and analyzed myself once I'd had a chance to cool down. She would have seen in the mirror that sometimes what we see in ourselves is something we don't like a whole lot. Martha was able to see that she was too focused on the cares of the world rather than listening to and learning from Jesus. In the magnifying glass, you can see that Jesus is clear that learning from him is more important than all busyness. With Peter, and that's what I'm going to finish with in this section, is that with Peter, if you remember, this is one of those very heart-touching things as well. Peter was with Jesus every day during his ministry. But when Jesus was taken before Ananias and Caiaphas, Peter was recognized in the crowd as being a follower of Christ. And 3 times he denies that he even knows Christ at all when he's asked. After Jesus is crucified and he's buried and raised from the dead, he ascends to heaven and appears to the disciples twice. From John 21, we receive the account of his second appearance to his disciples. At that time, he has a conversation with Peter. Now remember, Peter has denied him 3 times. And this is the conversation between him and Jesus. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger and dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." In the mirror, Peter could see that in times where he got very, very scared, his faith could be weak. His belief that Jesus was the Christ actually left him in that time that he was denying. And he denied Christ. However, when he'd had time to reflect on that, and you know that's all he would have done in the time between when Jesus was crucified and when he reappeared to them, he was able to see the next time he looked in the mirror that when Jesus questioned him as to his love, he openly admitted that he did love him. If he looked at Jesus in the magnifying glass at that time, he could see that despite Peter's denials, Christ reinstated him and commissioned him to kingdom work. He saw that Jesus would forgive him. And not only that, he would lovingly give him the opportunity of saying, "You know that I love you," 3 times. In essence, permitted him to cancel out the 3 denials when he said, "I do not know him." And Jesus still, when he looked at him through the magnifying glass, he realized he still considered Peter valuable in service to him. Jesus, shown magnified, was loving, merciful, forgiving, focused on the mission of spreading the gospel and salvation. I thought a lot about this because in life we have the small little trials that are like with Martha, that you can sort of have it happen and then that afternoon sit down and think it through and come up with some little gems to recall later on. But there is no denying there are trials and challenges and tough times that you go through that you don't come out on the other side that afternoon or that next week or that next day. You don't get that one opportunity when you hold up the mirror and go, "Well, how did I do with that?" But instead, a week later, you're saying, "How am I doing with that?" A month later, "How am I processing that?" A year later, where am I in the walk with God in this? You're still, it still hurts your heart, it still hurts your mind, it is still emotionally draining you, or you're still having to deal with it. And the Lord is constantly saying to you, "Well, look, how are you doing? Are you coming along? Are you getting closer? Do you trust me a little bit more? Is your faith a little bit greater?" And at the same time, he says, "Well, look in the magnifying glass at me. Have I been with you? Have I helped you through this? Am I still by your side?" He's constantly giving you those opportunities. I want to end quickly with reminding you of the prodigal son, because this is such a heartwarming issue as well. Really, we are in the place of the prodigal son so often. He was given all the money he was going to inherit. He goes out and decides he's going to live wild, do whatever he wants to, as if the money's going to last forever. Ultimately, it does not. He runs out completely. Starving, doing menial tasks, and still can barely get food in his belly. And he says, "Well, at home, the servants at least have food, so I am not going to go back to that house and ask that man to be my father. I have really done to the point of sinning against him. I'm not even going to go there with him." I'm just going to say, hey, I was your son. Can I come back and just be a servant just so I can survive? I'm not asking for anything else because I'm not worthy. That's how he saw himself in the mirror going home. I'm disgusting. I am filthy. I am starving. I have made mistakes. When he gets there, he's already expecting that same from his dad. Like his dad to me, I'm disappointed. You can't be my son and all these things. But instead, when he gets there and he sees his father through the magnifying glass, he sees a man running to him, arms outstretched, welcoming him, saying, my son is here, my son is here. Go get him a robe so he has something decent to wear. Go get a ring so that people know this is my son. Let's not just get a meal fix. Let's go kill the fatted calf and make a festival for him. Let's do all these wonderful things and reinstate him as my son. He doesn't have on shoes. Give him some sandals. And so he's able to see that his father wasn't what he thought his father was. Instead, he is loving, forgiving, merciful, just like our Lord. He is happy. He is celebratory that his son has come back.